Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping into the shoes of primary investigators and diving headfirst into the cosmic framework of a text that absolutely disrupted ancient Roman theater. We're looking at Titus Maccius Plautus' incredibly unique comedy, Rudens. This is a text that really demands we look closely at its intricate mechanical and ethical layers. And honestly, it is a fascinating ride.
To really rigorously dissect this text, we're going to follow a clear six-part roadmap. We'll look at the overarching thematic thesis, ground historical and geopolitical setting, deconstruct the composition and civic ethics, trace the dialectical progress of the central conflict, and then finally, we'll evaluate the completely wild survival of the physical manuscript itself.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Introduction and Thematic Thesis, focusing on the cosmic frame.
So, Plautus executes a radical departure from the standard claustrophobic urban streetscapes you normally see, like Athens or Thebes. Instead, Rudens isolates its characters on a wild, tempestuous seacoast near Cyrene. The thematic core is established literally immediately in the prologue by the constellation Arcturus, who actually descends to the stage wearing a stella candida, a bright white star. He explicitly frames the impending massive storm not just as some random meteorological event, but as a deliberate tool of cosmic retribution. It instantly sets up this morally ordered universe where divine providence is aggressively monitoring and punishing human wickedness.
Moving on to Section 2, Historical and Cultural Context, looking at Cyrene and cosmic justice.
Now, what's really interesting here is the specific geopolitical setting of Cyrene and how it completely alters the behavioral mechanisms of these characters. Plautus sets up this very deliberate contrast against the native historical concept of Greek tyche. See, in standard new comedy, tyche represents this kind of capricious, chaotic luck. But Plautus, he strips that away and replaces it with a rigid Roman mechanism of cosmic justice. The environment itself functions as an active agent of moral sorting. It deliberately wrecks the ship of the sacrilegious antagonists to forcibly restore equilibrium.
And this ethical intervention is actually grounded in highly specific economic realities. Cyrene's wealth relied heavily on the export of silphium, or lazarpicium, which was a vital medicinal drug obtained by cutting into the living root of a native plant. It was an export so absolutely crucial it was literally stamped right on Cyrenian coinage. So why does this matter for our text? Well, by anchoring the action in this concrete, cutthroat economic reality, the text intensely magnifies the friction between immense physical loss out at sea and the subsequent desperate clawing for material recovery back on land.
Okay, Section 3, Literary Composition and Style, breaking down the anatomy of a fabula polyada.
Let's see how this text builds upon earlier ancient literature by looking at its structural architecture. Plautus takes the work of the Greek playwright Diphilo, specifically his lost play Pyrrha, and uses it to dramatically expand the social landscape of the fabula polyada, which is basically a Roman comedy in Greek dress. By taking this traditional domestic comedy and transplanting it into an isolated, liminal space, Plautus is able to introduce really unique dramaturgical features. For example, we get a rare lyrical chorus of impoverished fishermen, which fundamentally alters the class dynamics of the entire genre.
And because of this isolation, stock plot-9 archetypes get flipped right on their heads. Take Daimones, the Senex, or old man. He functions as our moral compass, an exiled Athenian citizen whose innate civic virtue remains completely intact, even though he's geographically displaced. Then you have Labrox, the Lino, or pimp, who embodies this sacrilegious human trafficking. He gets stripped of all his wealth by the sea, but retains every ounce of his destructive avarice. And finally Trachelio, the servus calidus, or clever slave. He transforms from just a domestic trickster into a sharp-witted operational agent of justice, vigorously defending the vulnerable when civic infrastructure is entirely absent. Which brings us to Section 4, Ethical and Philosophical Framework, specifically asylum versus contract.
This archetypal flip brilliantly illustrates the internal ethics championed within the work. The text meticulously sets up this massive clash right on the beach. On one side, you have the sacred law of asylum, represented by the priestess Ptolemocratia granting sanctuary at the Temple of Venus. On the other side, you have the civil law of property. Labrox represents pure, unchecked capitalist greed in antiquity. He demonstrates total indifference to religious law and views human beings entirely through the lens of breached financial contracts. It sparks this fundamental, high-stakes conflict: basic human rights versus property jurisdiction in a wild space.
Now, we can actually ground this ethical debate directly in Roman jurisprudence, specifically the lex praetoria.
This legislation was designed to protect minores, essentially citizens under 25 years old, against fraud by requiring a praetor-appointed curator. Placidippus, our young lover, operates exactly in this vulnerable legal space, having been completely defrauded of his deposit by the lino. The text weaponizes this legal reality. It uses the total lack of urban magistrates out there on the beach to force a direct philosophical confrontation over ownership, sacrilege, and ultimately freedom.
Let's look at Section 5, dialectical progression, famously known as the trial of the rope.
The structural turning point of the whole plot arrives in Act 4, and it shifts the focus directly to internal psychological motivations over ownership and manumission. Grippus nets a heavy villainous, or trunk, using a Rudens, which is a rope. Traxalio intercepts this trunk from the shipwreck, initiating a rigorous and, frankly, completely absurd legal debate. I mean, think about it. You basically have two guys standing on a beach, screaming at each other over a wet trunk and a rope. As they passionately argue maritime salvage rights versus the reclamation of stolen property, Diamunus is appointed as the neutral arbiter. This moves the dialectic from a physical tug-of-war to a formalized tribunal right there on the sand.
And how is this dialectical conflict resolved? Through incredibly precise material evidence. Palestra establishes empirical ownership without even seeing the contents of the trunk. She says, and I quote, "Post altrinsequis securicula anipes, itidium aurea, literata, ibi matris nomen and securiculast." That is the absolute smoking gun of the play. Her exact memory of the crepusndia, specifically this inscribed golden axe bearing her mother's name, executes the dramatic recognition. It instantly collapses the legal dispute, proves her freeborn status, and flawlessly restores civic order.
Finally, Section 6, Transmission and Enduring Legacy, looking at the actual survival of the text itself.
The physical survival of this vital text reads like an archaeological thriller. The original manuscript was tragically defaced by 7th or 8th century scribes who literally erased this masterpiece to write completely unrelated material right over it. But incredibly, the underlying text was preserved in what is known as the Ambrosian palimpsest. Through the painstaking recovery efforts of modern scholars, specifically the authoritative collation in Studemann's Apocryphon and the structural analysis by Fleckesin, they essentially scraped this text back to life, meticulously restoring the integrity of Plautus's original work.
And this intensive philological reconstruction reveals dense lexical evidence that solidifies the play's enduring legacy. For instance, we observe metrical syncopation. To put that simply, Plautus allowed actors to use slang or drop syllables, kind of like us saying gonna instead of going to, just to make the poetry's rhythm work. We see this with the full dactylic vidillus versus the syncopated vidlus. This proves that complex, multi-layered phonetic realities existed in Old Latin, making the ancient text feel remarkably alive and human across centuries of transmission.
So, after unpacking all of this, it leaves us with a truly compelling question. If cosmic justice ultimately supersedes human jurisprudence in the wild spaces of the Fabula Palliata, how does Plautus's seacoast setting challenge the very limits of civil law? This text forces us to recognize that when civil institutions are just stripped away by the tempest, only innate moral rectitude and sacred obligation remain to enforce order. It is a profound secular moral teleology that continues to challenge our understanding of justice even today. Thanks so much for exploring this brilliant text with us, and we'll see you in the next explainer.